Welcome back. I'm Max Bergman, Director of the Stewart Center and Europe-Russia-Eurasia program at CSIS.
And I'm Maria Snegovaya, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia.
And you're listening to Russian Roulette, a podcast discussing all things Russia and Eurasia from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Hello and welcome back to Russian Roulette. I am Max Bergman, here with my co-host, as always, Maria Snegovaya. And today we are welcoming back a good friend of the pod, Michael Kofman. Mike doesn't need much of an introduction, but for those who need a refresher, he's a senior fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace here in DC, across the street from us here at CSIS. Additionally, he's a contributing editor at War on the Rocks, where he hosts the second best podcast on Russia in the Russia medium space. The Russia Contingency, it's a podcast on the Russian military and the war in Ukraine. Highly recommend everyone check it out. Mike is one of the leading military experts covering Russia today, and we're thrilled to have him back on the show. Mike, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Max.
Okay, Mike, we wanted to have you on the show to sort of initially do a deep dive on kind of where are we in the current phase of this war. Last fall, I think the last time we talked, I think the last time we had you on this podcast, we talked about where the war was going. Things were looking pretty dire for Ukraine. The Russia was gaining territory at a rather worrying clip. Ukraine had invaded Russia, had seized territory in Kursk. Now, we're halfway through the year. It's June 2025. How have the first 6 months of this year gone? Where do we currently stand? What's the sort of overview that you have when looking at this conflict?
Yes, I think you have to take it a little bit back to the winter, right? So going into the winter, things looked quite tenuous, and then Russian offensive momentum really slowed down. Part of that was the weather. Part of that was exhaustion. On the Russian side, they took pretty heavy casualties for the gains they were making in the fall. But also the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian political leadership made a conscious choice, an adaptation to the way the Russian military was fighting in 2024. Russian forces had generally eschewed any attempts at an operationally significant breakthrough after the Battle of Avdiivka. They were essentially pressing their way through the front, and it was very slow going for them, but you could see over time it was starting to work once you got into late summer. All right. The Ukrainian military then invested heavily in expanding drone units, setting up independent drone regiments, even a drone brigade, and focusing on stabilizing the front to a combination of mines and traditional prepared defenses, drone units, treating Russian forces in this kind of range of 0 to 15 kilometers, and traditional artillery fires. Okay, and that began to show benefits overall in helping stabilize the front, and that was an adaptation both to the way the Russian military was fighting and also to the challenges the Ukrainian military was having with manpower and the fact that Ukrainian mobilization recruitment was insufficient to keep up with both combat casualties, the AWOL issue, and the need to kind of generate additional forces in order to try to rotate units. So there were a lot of challenges last year. And I think they started to get on top of some of these things once again to the winter. All right. Now, fast forward to where we are today. That was a bit of a prologue, but it's important to have, I think, that context. So coming out of the winter, you saw the intensity of Russian offensive effort pick up a bit in mid-February, and that was focused primarily on Kursk, but also other areas. They were able to displace Ukrainian forces out of the Kursk salient come March. And then you saw a real increase in intensification of Russian offensive efforts around late March. And so we've been in a steady ramp up. So the folks who kind of ask, like, is the summer offensive happening? Has it started? And the honest answer is yes. There's not really going to be a discrete offensive. What you see right now is the Russian military making increased gains again, akin to the way things were looking in August, September of last year, along a couple of axes. So first, if you sort of followed the war, you'll be very familiar with some of the long-running battles. In Donetsk, Russian forces right now are essentially trying to create two big pockets, one around Konstantinovka, which troops call Konstaha, the other one on Kursk. And they've been mostly advancing in between these two, cutting between the two of them, And then further southwest of Pokrovsk, past the area where they took Velika Novosilka and Biodoshny, essentially they're right on the border, the regional border of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. They're barely a couple kilometers from it. Okay, there's another push kind of north of Liman, and that's an attempt to create another axis that could threaten Slavyansk from the north. There's still kind of slow going fighting around Kupiansk that hasn't gone very far. And one of the other, I think, particularly problematic axes, of which I really see two. The first one is the advance they've made between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, which essentially threatens to create two sizable pockets in that area. But the second is a steady encroachment in Sumy and the fact that Russian airborne and naval infantry are focused there in establishing a buffer north of Sumy. There, the terrain is such that Sumy itself is kind of a bit in a valley. So now they're threatening northern Sumy and have forced an evacuation of outer line parts of the region north of the city. That's quite problematic. Essentially, what was the Kursk operation has now ended up in a sort of Russian buffer or incursion in Sumy Oblast. So where we are today. The front is not collapsing, but you see Russian forces making increased gains from April to May. In May, it was over 500 square kilometers. That's not a lot, but a lot for me depends on what's kind of the 3-month trend. If it continues to increase, if we're going into June and July, as Russian offensive effort intensifies, then that's a bit worrisome. But yeah, my general sense of it is that the front is neither stabilized on the key operational axes, nor is it in a particularly dire condition either, right? Ukrainian forces are still holding Russia to fairly, incremental gains. The last part, you see the Russian military consciously attempting to institute counter adaptations to the Ukrainian adaptations, which maybe if you're interested, we can get into, which also to some extent are showing some results for them. That is, they look at the way the Ukrainian military adapted to fight in 2024 and stalled their offensive effort, so they are making investments to counter that.
Thank you very much, Mike. Can I ask specifically about the manpower situation in Ukraine? You talked about it already, but specifically in the winter 2024, this was the major issue. And just recently in Ukraine, we've heard Zelensky allegedly hinting at the possibility of lowering the conscription age to 18 years old. What's your take on this? Is Ukraine able to solve it? And also, how about its domestic defense adaptation given the current situation?
So the manpower situation, from my point of view, has been one of the main issues since pretty much fall of 2023, and I haven't seen that change. It's the main issue last year. I think it's going to be the main issue this year. I was impressed by how well the Ukrainian military adapted to employ a low density of forces to still hold the front line in the way they're fighting. But I think that manpower will continue to be a challenge for the Ukrainian military. The mobilization rate is simply too low for the force that needs to be sustained at the front. If you want to enable any kind of rotation rather than exhausting the brigades that are there. The second problem was AWOLs. I think they've gotten much better in dealing with the AWOL issue, which was a big problem last year. This is absence without leave. And a lot of personnel would leave units they didn't like to go join units that they did like. But this is not a rational way to manage the force. So this is a challenge as well. It may seem like, okay, well, some percentage of these folks then went back to rejoin other units that they want to fight in. Yeah, but you can't manage a force that way. Like that's a bit of a problem. So as far as lowering the age for recruitment, they launched several initiatives from every brigade trying to recruit personnel and advertise for volunteers to contract recruitment centers to an initiative to get younger folks to sign up under volunteer service contracts. But the numbers they've gotten, in my view, are too low to address the overall problem. As mobilization still makes up the majority of the personnel that the military receives. And I don't think lower the conscription age, if they are even going to debate it. And Maria, I'll be very honest, I highly doubt that Zelensky will do this, just based on everything I know and seen in Ukraine. I don't think it'll solve the problem. First, a lot of younger people who wanted to go and fight have already done that. This is the 4th year of the war, not the 4th month. If people wanted to go and fight, they've had the opportunity to sign up, and many of them have already gone and joined the military. Younger folks who wanted to join the military can't do that there is a path for doing this as well. So I don't know who they really get. Lastly, a lot of the younger people are Ukraine are not necessarily seen as in any way, shape, or form a solution, and they are by far the thinnest demographic slice if you look at Ukraine realistically. So the challenge Ukraine has is really one born of force management, insufficient mobilization of the manpower they do have, particularly in the 30, 40-year-old category, and some of these can be addressed. It's very hard to say, can any country just solve the manpower problem in the war? It's not something you solve. When you look at munitions, defense industrial mobilization, and force issues like force generation and mobilization, these are treadmills you're constantly running on. They're not a thing you solve during a war, right? The problem that I saw emerge starting from late 2023, but particularly last year, is that the Russian recruitment effort was working. They have been recruiting an average of 35,000 men per month, and they are still, unfortunately, doing reasonably well in recruitment early in 2025. So they're not only able to replace their high losses, they've consistently expanded the force. Right? If you look at loss replacement versus generating additional formations, it's probably maybe a 70-30 split on their end, but they're recruiting at a monthly uh, sort of a monthly rate that exceeds their unrecoverable losses, right? So it's kind of the problem. And Ukraine's been offsetting the Russian manpower advantage by trying to find more tactically innovative ways of fighting through better integration, through better tactics, through better employment of technology. Manpower, I think, is going to remain an issue throughout the course of this war, right? That's just the way I see it. Um, you can adapt to your disadvantages and emphasize your comparative advantages, but this is going to be a continued problem.
I want to ask about Russian adaptation in a second, but it does seem that there's maybe been a strategic shift in how Ukraine is thinking about fighting this war from last fall. It seemed last fall, at least before the US election, the Ukrainians had this focus on training brigades to do offensive operations, the idea that they would at some point go back on the offensive, punch through in the war, take back territory. Now it seems a bit of a shift where Ukraine is sort of hunkering down to just sort of be on the defensive. Is that how you see it? Has there been a strategic shift in kind of how the Ukrainian military is now approaching this conflict to one where they're going to try to take advantage of being on the defensive, let the Russians come at them, try to trick the Russians as much as possible that way, but focus less on building new brigades and units with that idea that they're going to be able to punch through, break through, and take the war back to the Russians?
That's a good question, Max. So I think early last year, when Syrski came in as the commander in chief, he sort of pursued a strategy of active defense, which is, um, in some areas positional defense, but where possible, active defense, where Ukrainian forces locally counterattack. And they have done that throughout the course of the last year and a half, particularly when Russian units are conducting rotation. It's a big point of vulnerability for both forces when they're doing rips and what have you. But beyond maintaining pressure and localized counterattacks, the big question to me is Ukraine going to attempt something like another Kursk operation or not? Kursk was a surprise for me. So if you had asked me this question last June, I would have answered to you faithfully to the best of my knowledge that yes, Ukraine is largely going to pursue a defensive strategy of localized counterattacks and work to exhaust Russian offensive potential while expanding its own strike capabilities to really kind of work the body, right? That is, work critical infrastructure relevant to Russian economy or defense industrial production or rear support components, right, of the fight. And that would have been a very fair assessment, except it would have been wrong come August, right? So the best I can tell you is, yeah, I think so. I think I don't know if what I learned from the Kursk operation is the same thing that Ukrainian leadership learned, though. And that's kind of a challenge. So you have to keep that in mind, that the people who make decisions on these things are not analysts. Sometimes I occasionally read like funny articles and reports by people who believe that analysts walk into a room and they tell policymakers what they think, and policymakers listen and say, "These are amazing ideas. We should just do everything you want to do."
Mike, shh, that's how it works in think tank
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
That's our
yeah.
influence.
This I think what happens when where you think that Tom Clancy films are documentaries, and Jack Ryan just sort of tells people what they really should do in the meeting, and they're like, okay, that analyst who none of us know he's really on it. We should listen to him instead of just saying don't invite that guy to the meeting again, which is more likely, which is the more likely thing to happen.
Definitely more likely. What do you think happened? What's your take on the Kursk offensive? And now that we have some daylight between it and the Ukrainian withdrawal.
Yeah, I was very much willing to kind of give it the benefit of the doubt early on when it happened. I thought that it would have been much more successful as a 2-week raid. I thought tactically it was a success, and it demonstrated that Ukraine still had offensive potential and could put the pieces together for some kind of offensive operation against a prepared defense, even if it wasn't, the main part of the defensive line where Russian forces were deployed. I think the challenge, though, is that I didn't see it having the operational effects that they hoped for. It eventually shifted some Russian drone units from the Donetsk front to counter the Kursk salient, but then they shifted back. And like drone units are not mechanized divisions. Elite drone units can firefight and run from one part of front to another. The problem was that the Ukrainian forces ended up kind of holding the salient, and the geometry of a salient by definition is unfavorable. You're surrounded on 3 sides. Okay, like that's um, just the both the geometry and the geography wasn't that favorable either. So I thought it was actually quite impressive and surprising that the Ukrainian military held it for that long. But it allowed Russia to use North Korean troops. They then expanded the use of fiber optic cable drones, eventually crimped the few ground lines of communication available, and then there was effectively a logistical collapse, and the Ukrainian military was forced to withdraw. I think my bottom line is that it could have gone a lot worse than it did. But did the Kursk operation change the dynamic of this war? No. Did it have very significant positive operational effects? I'm not even going to use the word strategic because, in our field, the word strategic gets abused for everything. It's debatable. My view of that is skeptical. It's not really. I think probably in retrospect that operation would have gotten better if it was 2 weeks long rather than the many months that they ended up holding in Kursk. And lastly, the downside, I mean, there are a couple, right? Everything comes with opportunity costs. There's no kind of free lunch in making decisions like this. Well, to some extent, a lot of equipment was used up in that operation. That's probably one of the few operations where the loss ratio of equipment between Ukraine and Russia was 1-to-1 or worse. It's very rare in this whole war. Usually Ukraine's attrition ratio on equipment is sort of at least 3-to-1 in its favor in most cases. So when you're in a time period where you're not expecting a lot more equipment, a lot more support from the West, you have to really manage your resources. You can't afford an operation that's kind of a bridge to nowhere, where you're losing way too much equipment relative to what you're getting out of it. And so this is just one example, but okay, the way I look at it is it could have gone a lot worse than it did. If you're asking me, do I think Ukraine should do another Kursk operation in the future? Or do the cross-border raids that I've seen in Belgrade and other places, these small-scale attacks to try to pin Russian forces there, are they the best use of Ukrainian assault regiments and Ukrainian personnel and Ukrainian equipment? No, but I'm not in charge. I'm just an analyst. These are just my own views. You take them for what they're worth.
And Michael, on the topic of the badass Ukrainian operations, what's your take on the recent Spiders web attack? And for our listeners who may have missed it, this is an effort on the side of Ukrainian security services to secretly smuggle drones into Russia, launching them from the back of trucks and using them to destroy a significant number of Russian strategic bombers. So some analysts say that was cool, but it's not going to radically alter the situation on the front line. But at the same time, others say that Russian strategic bombers potentially really useful resource for Russia, and being hit is a really painful area where Russia was hit there. What's your take on it?
Well, the words "it was cool" is definitely a well-established terminology in military analysis. So I will
You're welcome.
fully support the sentiments of whoever said that. I too think it was cool. Um, and with this sort of brilliant and kind of erudite assessment, what I will add is I thought it was a very, very interesting and innovative attack. I know some details about it. I've gotten to know that are not fully public, which makes it even more kind of interesting to me. I'm not going to share them on the podcast, sorry. But what I will say is that attack dealt a fairly significant blow to Russian long-range aviation and to the park of Soviet aircraft, modernized Soviet aircraft that Russia had, which, given the extent to which it degraded them, if you look at the impact, it's maybe 10% of the overall fleet, but probably 20-25% or more of the operationally ready fleet, if you assume an operational readiness rate of around 40% for Russian bombers, which is, I think, fair. It could even be worse. So I did the numbers. I think I posted them on Twitter at some point. I don't want to go back to kind of the counts. People can look at it, but I think the battle damage assessment on that has converged on a number of aircraft. So it depends on how many were damaged, but you're looking at a sizable impact. Is it going to halt Russian missile strikes, some of which are always delivered by Russian long-range aviation, like Kh-101 cruise missiles? No, probably not. It will degrade kind of the max salvo capacity that the Russian aerospace forces have, but it's not enough to halt them. Is it a significant impact, though, on a fairly important assets to the Russian military? Yes, and actually, in some respects, it really damages Russian military power when you think beyond Ukraine. Russian ability to reconstitute. In many of these cases, Russia will not be able to reconstitute the loss to these aircraft. It doesn't make Tu-95 MSs, and Tu-22 M3s or Ts, at best, they recently restored the ability to make Tu-160, but artisanally. I mean, at a sort of rate that won't substitute for the losses they suffered. So this was a very, very dark day for Russian long-range aviation. And it actually, I think, showed that a lot more things are at risk in Russia than Russian leadership might suspect. Now, of course, like the bigger takeaway is that the biggest screw up is obviously on the side of FSB. The fact that for a year and a half, multiple teams had put this in place, had developed a way to remotely operate these drones using Russian cell networks, etc., and had been able to conduct a simultaneous attack on, or attempt a simultaneous attack on 5 different targets. I think this is very impressive. And very unimpressive performance by Russian FSB. What else can I add to it? Now, but I don't think we should strawman things and say, hey, does this attack change the game or the dynamic of the war? No, it's not meant to. But it makes significant impact, right? It's very hard to think of any one attack that would do that. But this is notable. Like I said, if anything, it actually hurts Russia much more when it comes to Russian strategic operations and planning vis-a-vis NATO, because they rely on large-scale employment of long-range precision-guided conventional weapons, and Russia's biggest limitation is not in munitions, it's in means of delivery, platforms, okay? Because it limits your salvo size and what you can achieve. And when you start cutting considerably the number of operationally ready aircraft available, that is an impact, right? So in many ways, Ukraine is doing us a service, even if that's a secondary positive effect.
Mike, let me ask you sort of a broader strategic question about what is sort of Russia's game plan here militarily. The talks between Russia, Ukraine, orchestrated by this administration, don't really seem to be going anywhere. It never quite seemed like they were really, gathered any significant momentum. I think it seemed to me that both sides were kind of wanting to just blame the other side for why the talks weren't going to be successful. But it also seemed to me that if you're Russia, if you're Putin, you sort of see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel now. U.S. support for Ukraine is likely in a glide path down. Weapons deliveries from the United States to Ukraine are continuing. But there's not going to be another supplemental. The Trump administration is not going to go to Congress, at least I don't expect it to ask for more funding. So that means, all the money spent by the Biden administration is kind of, that's it. And it's a lot of money, so there's a lot more stuff coming. But, what is Russia's game plan here? Have their maximalist goals shifted? If you're the Russian general staff and Putin calls you in and says, what's our theory of the case here? Are they just sort of, we're just going to keep banging our head against this Ukrainian wall and hope that, we break a hole at some point? What is the plan here? What is being told to Putin? And what do you think is the kind of broader Russian military strategy looking out, not just over the next few months, but really over the next few years?
All right, Max, this is no easy question. Okay, so right up front, I'll tell you, I don't know for a fact what the Russian plan is. And anyone who says they do is probably trying to sell you something. As you know, Moscow's full of people who will always tell you that they themselves know what the plan is. And then you quickly find out that they also didn't know what the plan was. And sometimes they don't, sometimes genuinely they don't know the plan because one person happens to decide the plan and he doesn't know what it is, right? So it's not always known. But with all those caveats in place, if we look at what we can observe from behavior, right? We don't know the plan, but we can observe behavior. First, it's clear that the Russian military intends to keep pushing through 2025. The idea that there's going to be a summer offensive and then something happens after the summer and that's the window for negotiations, I think is quite wrong. In fact, I heard an argument like this last year that Russian military would be exhausted come summer and they weren't. The only thing that's going to really slow them down is once we get into the winter, we get into December. Second, they are probably going to start reaching diminishing returns once we do get into the fall and the winter, right? Does that mean that Putin will decide that even though they do not hold the prospect of making significant gains on the battlefield, that they should give up and quit? Not necessarily. I think a lot depends actually on macroeconomic factors and these other inputs, these things on the other side of the ledger, which significantly affect political decision making on to what extent is the war sustainable? If it looks like the war is more or less sustainable to them, like they feel they can manage it into 2026, then likely they'll try to keep going. That's my assumption. That's always my assumption. The safer assumption is the war's going to keep going rather than they're going to make a deal. And everything I have observed so far, right, in the last couple of months, Max, I don't know if your opinion is different, has not disabused me of that base assumption.
I think that's been my base assumption. I mean, they especially if you look at it in the U.S. role is going to be less supportive than you.
Sure.
There's reason for hope
Well,
on their
okay.
side.
So when it comes to the U.S. role, uh, and also I think it's important to discuss what is the fighting really about? Because let's say over under Russian offensive takes some more territory in Donetsk, but the war doesn't get decided by who controls Pokrovsk. Okay, I know this town. I've gotten to know it pretty well, or Konstantinovka. Fine, but like if Konstantinovka is lost, the war is not lost for Ukraine, right? So if the Russian military is able to, even if they take Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, and all of Donetsk, okay, and what? That's not really what the war is about. What's really being tested in the fighting is the fighting provides information for negotiations about whose hand is really stronger. And what's being tested is the question of what is less sustainable, Russian offensive effort or Ukrainian defense? That's the matter in question because it informs negotiation and both these parties' expectations, but also the expectations of external actors who are material parties to the war. Does that make sense? So us, Europeans, whatnot. So that's what's being demonstrated over the course of these operations, and that's important to keep in mind. That really what we're looking at is how do we assess each other our own respective expectations based on what we see happening on the battlefield. Regarding U.S. support, yeah, it's on a kind of declining glide path, but with a couple of big caveats. First, it's clear that what we've been providing Ukraine are things that were actually programmed during the Biden administration. And those things are going to run out at some point, I think, after the summer. But there's still quite a bit that has been delivered, together with European support and the prospect of Europe being able to buy munitions and other things from the United States. Ukraine can be sustained in this fight. Second, this administration is not out of presidential drawdown authority. They haven't really used it. They still have the original 3.8. But the fact that they haven't used it tells us that while they are not, I'm trying to find the right way to put this because I myself don't fully understand it, while they are not walking away from Ukraine, or at least it seems like they're walking away from walking away right now, they are also not interested in owning the war in any way, shape, or form and keep framing it as the previous administration's war. So they don't want to authorize any new PDs, right, for Ukraine, which is problematic. Because they don't want this war to become their policy. Does that make sense? That's the way I interpret it. That's just my own view of it. But like I'm another person
Yeah.
in DC just like you are. So this is my own point of view. On top of that, they still have billions of USAI funding they're chewing through, which is going to take quite a bit of time because it's things that get put on contract, that have to be made. So there's plenty more money kind of in the mix there than people think or know from my point of view. Okay. Next, they could actually go to Congress and ask for another billion or two, at least in replenishment funding for DoD. It's not going to
dramatically change things, but $1 billion can go a pretty long way, and then try to use that under this administration to authorize some more presidential drawdowns. I don't know if they're going to do that. I'm just saying the option is there. No, there's not going to be another major funding package or supplemental for Ukraine. That is very obvious, right? Fully agreed with you on that. But another $1 billion, I think, could be in the offing. Lastly, so yeah, they're on a glide path, but Ukraine is increasingly more self-sufficient for day-to-day battlefield needs. It makes a lot. Europe's invested in Ukraine's defense sector. Europeans have picked up the slack significantly from the US over the last 2 years. I used to gripe about them quite a bit. Like, kind of grudgingly and lovingly, like, hey, Europe, major conventional war in European theater. Maybe you should really get on top of defense industrial production and issuing multi-year contracts for the thing that you say is existential for the security architecture of Europe. But judging by your body language, you seem to be very late to your own rhetoric. But they got there, like not fully, let's say partially. Okay. So where we are this year, I think, yeah, Ukraine can be sustained through 2025. I do see a lot of challenges in some areas later this year on munitions, and more importantly, the big question remains whether or not we are willing to keep selling, key types of capability.
Ukraine, right? Interceptors for Patriot, PAC-2, PAC-3 air and missile defense? Do we keep selling GMLRS for HIMARS? Do we keep providing certain types of munitions and parts? If we're willing to do that, then I don't think that the situation is that bad for Ukraine. But you're also right in that there is no major sustained U.S. investment in this war. There is no U.S. effort to enable Ukraine to achieve something in this war, either that I can see. Ukraine is in many respects going to have to pursue this on its own with Europeans, and the most that right now it can hope for is just sustainment of current level support and steady decline of that support. I agree with you. That's kind of the pessimistic conclusion I've come to. We're not in the worst case scenario, right? The worst case scenario was Trump administration in May saying, all right, timeline, we ran out of time. We're walking away. We're halting any further additional program shipments. We're halting intelligence support. And no, Europeans, we're not selling anything to you. Everything now is focused on the Indo-Pacific. Best of luck to you, in the situation. That's not happening. So at least it's fair to say that we're very far from the worst case scenario. We're also quite far from the best case scenario too, yeah. Right? We are in that unhappy middle. And I know what wars look like when people are prosecuting unhappy middle. Actually, the U.S. is the master of this policy-wise. In my professional career, have gotten to watch several conflicts that we were involved in where we were absolutely the master of the unhappy middle.
I mean, it seems to me, just to sum up before turning over to Maria, I think on the Russian side, it strikes me that this war is sustainable. They're going to keep fighting it. Hopefully things start to go better for them. And, there's some hope that Ukraine just sort of keeps getting hollowed out. The Europeans don't quite step up. Trump administration pulls back faster. And then 2026, that's, the Russians then just continue on. And that the wars become sustainable. In some ways, just like what a long war, the U.S. was fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan or Vietnam, that you just keep going year by year. Now, all those conflicts ended up not going that well for us, but they were sustainable until they weren't, until we just decided we were done with this. And that I think that kind of seems to me what the Russian strategy is. That there's a plan, there's a hope. Let's see if you can get there, keep attriting the Ukrainians, and then in a couple years, maybe you'll actually get there. And if not, then you can sort of dial back, turn down, really ratchet up negotiations.
And may I just add to that maybe Putin has read Paul Kennedy, famous historian and political scientist, who flagged that in The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, his famous book, that historically speaking, victory has repeatedly gone to the side with a more flourishing productive base. So when the Russians basically look at the material side of things, they may be justified to believe that they hold an upper hand in this story.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. I can only give you my perspective on, which is that I think that both sides in this war, Russia and Ukraine, are right now holding on, hoping first that conditions shift to some extent in their favor, especially when it comes to their respective negotiating positions. Both sides are pinning hope that the other one their war effort will have to collapse for reasons other than anything that can be observed in the battlefield. And I know historically plenty of wars like this, okay, where the Russian leadership has been consistently telling itself something that observably isn't true. That Ukraine's on the verge of collapse. Next offensive operation, they're just gonna the front will collapse of its own accord because of all the problems, or that the West will abandon Ukraine. We're not, and Ukraine's not on the verge of collapse, and the front line's not about to collapse either. So reality is Ukraine's proven remarkably resilient, and a lot of kind of worst case scenarios haven't happened. And to some extent, I've seen this quite a bit in the West, especially earlier this year. I started to see a lot of just sort of wishful thinking about the Russian economy. And while the Russian economy may not be in a place that they can sustain this war for the next 3 years, they seem okay through 25 and well going into 2026. That's the unfortunate reality. And I would hear a number of folks talking about some perfect storm in the Russian economy or other things that simply, I can't see, certainly not this year, and hoping that this is going to deliver to them some kind of positive outcome. Or there's also always the belief that, hey, we have all these sanctions cards we're not playing, we're not using, which some we do, but I'll put it this way. I'm a big believer in the impact of sanctions. I also believe that the sanctions community is by far the most optimistic policy community in Washington, D.C. about what their ideas and policies can achieve. Like in terms of expectations relative to performance, just going off my own experience, I've always been skeptical of what I'm told, that we have these amazing sanctions cards to play that will substantially alter Russian calculations, particularly in the sufficient near term, right? Because you're looking at the next 1-2 years. You're not asking people, give me a slow poison that will suffocate the Russian economy over the course of a decade. I mean, that's great, but the problem one is the war. So that's where I'm a lot more skeptical on how much impact they can have on a sufficiently relevant timeline. I think on our end, part of the challenge is that unless the front is to some extent effectively stabilized, right, the Russian leadership and Russian leaders can continue telling them the story that just need to give it more time, and eventually something will crack, right, and to their advantage. And so as long as they're materially advantaged, even if the Russian military tactically is really underperforming relative to the advantages they have, I think it's very clear by Russian behavior in negotiations that they don't want to make a big compromise. They're not willing to accept something like an Istanbul Minus. And this goes back to kind of the very beginnings and the origins of the war. If you remember the original negotiations with Russia before the war began, Putin didn't want the deal. He wanted the war. I'm sorry. I've always been amongst those folks. Maria, Max, you will remember our conversations, well before the full-scale invasion began. And I was quite confident that they were going to do it. He didn't want the deal. He wanted the war. And we're still in that place. He doesn't want the deal. He doesn't want anything approaching a reasonable compromise, despite the fact that Russian military performance on the ground can't achieve Putin's political aims. What he wants is either Ukrainian or Western capitulation. It looked for a couple months like he couldn't get Ukraine's, but he might get the U.S. Now it's looking like maybe he's not going to get U.S., so he's going back to trying to get Ukraine's. And that to me explains a lot about Russia's negotiating position, right? And so from my point of view, that they retain fairly maximalist war aims.
Michael, to your point about Russian economic situation, we actually just released a report basically largely congruent with your assessment. So for once, we actually align on the sanctions economy topic. But yes, our estimation that unfortunately for Ukraine, the situation in the Russian economy is not great, but it's also not dire enough. At the same time, our colleagues from Defense and Security program released another brief just recently, also showing that the war is highly inefficient for Russia. That, just to give you some estimates, Russia has paid extraordinary blood price for seizing less than 1% of Ukraine territory since 2024 and suffered as many as 5 times the number of fatalities in Ukraine in just over 3 years than all Russian and Soviet wars combined since the end of the Second World War. That seems tremendous, enormous. Now, the economic situation is also not great, and they're losing a lot of weapons. So the question is, especially looking at the battlefield and the innovation, what do you think is the area that Russia could prioritize in terms of development of its potentially drones or electronic warfare tech going forward? Maybe it's worth for Russia wanted to substitute for the way it's fighting with something more innovative. Now, do you have a sense of what's the best approach that the Kremlin's going to choose now?
So first, look, on the stats, yeah, but those statistics can give you cold comfort, right? I could show you World War I stats on number of manpower lost and munitions expended relative to territory gained, and I can show you how World War I ended for Germany. So we need to be a bit careful on combat stats. On the one hand, that's all true, and the Russian results are very unimpressive for what they spent on it, especially given that in this war, one of their principal political aims is the acquisition of territory. On the other hand, their principal aim is Ukraine's capitulation and really destruction of Ukraine as a sustainable independent state. When I look at, I think the results on their end are quite unimpressive. But I don't think that is their interpretation of it, right? And what matters is how the political leadership and the military leadership actually interprets this. They see this as a regional war. They see this as a war not just with Ukraine, but also as a conflict with NATO. And the way they frame it, and of course, I'm sure it's a rationalization on their part, but I think from the way they frame it, they're not just taking Ukraine on, they're taking on the United States and everybody else that's supporting Ukraine. All right. Regarding the way they're actually fighting, so they burned through a lot of Soviet equipment that they had in stocks. I think their biggest challenge moving forward is they're using up a lot of Soviet legacy. They still have quite a bit of it in the force. The depots are increasingly running empty, but there's quite a bit of equipment still yet to be processed. Russian new production probably amounts for 20% or less of what they're currently getting when we look particularly at various types of major land warfare systems. But it is increasing. It visibly increased quite a bit. If you look at tank and infantry fighting vehicle production, it's well below what they need to replace their loss in this war, but it's quite above what they were producing in 2022 and 2021. From a technology standpoint, they continue to online new types of drone systems, new types of ISR platforms, and new types of munitions, new types of electronic warfare capabilities. They had substantially expanded the use of fiber optic cable drones, and then those became much longer range systems, and it's starting to change the dynamic at the tactical level of the war. And I think people are missing this, particularly the last couple of months. What's been happening is that Russian drone units are now employing fiber optic cable drones routinely at a distance of 20-25 kilometers behind the forward line of troops with a max range of 50 kilometers. At least the spools go up to 50 km. That then now allowed them to attack a lot of the capabilities that are in the rear and close off ground lines of communication. And what they're investing heavily is still in the positional approach that's trying to displace Ukrainian forces by cutting off logistics and cutting off support to them. And this seemed to, I think, work for them in Kursk. And so they're now using this everywhere they can. Second, they have substantially expanded their drone component of the force, following in Ukraine's footsteps, and are actively trying to target Ukrainian drone teams because that's the part of the Ukrainian military that, for lack of a better word, is doing a lot of the lifting. If you look at where most Russian casualties are coming from, what's stopping Russian attacks, it's Ukrainian drone units, right? In combination with mines, with traditional artillery. But if we kind of look at what is the engine of that fight at the tactical level on the Ukrainian side, it's definitely drone formations. The Russian military is very much trying to come after them. Some of their adaptations are negative adaptations. They're not impressive unless you really like the sport of motocross and you think that motorcycle and light ATV assaults are like the future of warfare. But for me, a very useful case study for the tanks are obsolete crowd, because I want them to take a good look at the last couple of months for all the people that want to get out of a tank and get on a motorcycle and try to assault that way. But this is, again, an attempt to get past the defeat zone that Ukrainian units have established. And Ukrainian military actually is much more optimized to deal with mechanized assaults now than these types of attacks. We have a much longer conversation on kind of new technologies and things that Russia will be investing in. But in general, you can see that they have substantially increased production of precision-guided weapons of different types, of drone systems, loitering munitions. Now you can see them employing a new light type of cruise missiles, because this is one of the biggest gaps in everybody's arsenal today. Light, cheaper form of precision strike that can be used in much larger numbers. And This is the direction I think the war is going to go. By late 25, I think you're going to see Ukraine have much greater strike capabilities beyond just drones, okay? And Russia trying to online larger numbers of cheaper strike systems that will allow basically much greater flexibility in how it employs precision strike capabilities. And it's a much longer conversation, but what I basically see on the Russian side is both degradation in the force quality and how ground forces are being used and performing. And this essentially is one of their main problems, why they cannot execute any complex attacks at scale, and why Russian higher level commands keep planning operations that the force can't actually execute the tactical level, right? This is sort of, I will draw you red lines on a map, but the force can't actually do those things. That's the problem. Like once we get from Army HQ to Divisional HQ, but then you get into the battalion commander, the people that he has can't execute those tasks. This is problem one. Problem two is they don't have a lot of the enablers, and they're trying different ways to break through the way Ukraine's mounting a defense, but not that successfully. But on the other hand, they've got a lot better at dynamic targeting, precision strike, and integration, how they run the fight. So there are areas where they've improved and the areas where they've degraded significantly. Sorry. I too am working on some written products in this area, as I'm sure you know. But for those who are interested, I had a report last year on Russian military adaptation looking at 2022 through about 24. I think it's up on Carnegie's website. Maria Max, I very much look forward to reading your report on the Russian war economy and checking out the findings from that.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely put a link to your report in the show notes as well as our Russian economy paper. I sort of imagine it that Putin has sort of just, looked at the map and he's just sort of draws a red arrow towards Kyiv and says, go. And then then Russian forces and Russian generals say, okay, they salute, and then they go.
Max, can I tell you a silly theory that I have? Because at some points I've seen Putin brief their gains in cities like Chasiv Yar or other places, or Vuhledar, and I think this. Don't quote me on this anyway. I was listening to this. It's just a silly bar theory. What I think happens, but I think Gerasimov shows up with a map, and the map is really zoomed in. It's really zoomed in on Konstantinovka or Pokrovsk or some town, okay? And the map is barely scale, 10 by 10 kilometers. And he's showing how much they've taken over the last month. He's like, look, we've taken, 50% of this. And it looks really impressive unless you zoom out to the entire front and then you see that on 1,200 kilometer front, they've taken this small city that used to have 60,000 people living in it, tops. But the map as he presents it looks quite neat. Part of the reason I say that because I've seen Putin publicly state stats that they now control 30% or 50% or something. And I think wow, somebody must have shown him a map shaded in red and told him, look, we're making all this progress. Look how much we control this, Velika Novosibirsk.
I mean, I think military officers, it doesn't matter the nationality, are quite good at sort of juking the stats and demonstrating. We did this in Vietnam and kill ratios and other things like that, where you can find ways to sort of demonstrate progress, especially to a leader that is demanding it. But Mike, we are going to have to leave it there. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining Russian Roulette. And as always, if you haven't, please sure to subscribe to our show and give us a 5-star rating. Additionally, if you haven't already, be sure to check out our sister podcast, the Eurofile, wherever you get your podcasts. And also be sure to check out Mike's podcast, The Russia Contingency, through the suite of War on the Rocks podcasts. It's really excellent. And Mike, thanks again for joining us. Maria, thank you as always. And we will see you next time.
You've been listening to Russian Roulette. We hope you enjoyed this episode and tune in again soon.
Russian Roulette releases new episodes every 2 weeks on Thursdays and is available wherever you get your podcasts. So please subscribe and share our episodes online.
And be sure to check out all the latest analysis by the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at csis.org.